It was the spring of 1944. The air in the American POW camp hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, a constant reminder of the harsh winters that had tested these prisoners long before they ever stepped foot on the campgrounds. Rows of grey-uniformed women, weary and gaunt, shuffled along narrow gravel paths, their faces etched with exhaustion, distrust, and a lingering disbelief at the world beyond the battlefields they had known. War had stripped them of everything familiar, home, family, the simple certainties of everyday life, and yet here they were, standing at the threshold of a moment so small, so ordinary. It felt almost unreal. From a distance came the faint, golden aroma of freshly baked bread, mingling with the soft warmth of butter that had just been spread across its crusty surface. The women paused, noses twitching, eyes widening, hearts hesitant to hope. Could it be true? Bread fresh and warm, untainted by the rations they had survived on for months? The camp guards, uniformed in crisp American blues, moved with quiet precision, placing plates in front of the prisoners with a deliberate care that seemed almost ceremonial. Each slice was more than food. It was an act of kindness, a gesture so foreign to their experiences that disbelief painted their faces with every glance. In that instant, time slowed. The cold, rigid lines of the camp softened. The first taste was nothing short of transformative, though in that moment none of the women would have found the words to describe it. For months, for what seemed like years, they had endured a monotonous existence of barely edible rations, thin, watery soups, and the hard, stale bread that crumbled in their hands and left behind a dry, sandy taste in their mouths. They had grown accustomed to surviving, not living, moving through the camp with hollow eyes and quiet resignation, each day a repetition of the last, measured in the hours between meals and roll calls. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at their bellies, yet they had long ceased to expect anything beyond sustenance meant merely to prolong their survival. Yet now, as the freshly baked bread was set before them, warm from the oven, still giving off tendrils of steam, and slathered with creamy, melting butter that glistened in the soft overhead light, something inside them stirred, a sense that perhaps life could still surprise them. The first slice was tentative. A hand lifted it slowly, fingers trembling not from weakness, but from a mixture of hope, disbelief, and the lingering tension of a lifetime spent in fear and deprivation. The bread was heavy in their hands, soft yet with a crust that crackled gently as they broke it apart. The butter, spread thick and rich, slid across the surface, melting immediately from the bread's warmth. And when they finally lifted it to their lips, the aroma alone, yeasty, warm, buttery, was intoxicating. Their eyes widened. Some let out inaudible gasps, and others froze mid-motion, unsure if such a thing could truly exist in their lives. It was as if time itself had paused, the chaotic, harsh world outside the camp's fences receding, leaving only this moment, a golden slice of bread in a grey-uniformed hand, held with a reverence usually reserved for acts of profound significance. As the first bites were taken, a symphony of reactions spread across the room. Some women closed their eyes, letting the taste wash over them, savouring every nuance, the slight crisp of the crust, the softness of the interior, the creamy richness of the butter melting on their tongues. Others looked around at their companions, seeking confirmation that they were not alone in this moment, that they too were experiencing the impossible miracle of simple sustenance. Soft murmurs began to ripple through the hall, words of wonder, disbelief, and the tentative beginnings of laughter. It was quiet at first, almost cautious, as though any sound might shatter the illusion. But slowly, the murmurs grew into whispers, and whispers into soft laughter, fragile yet genuine, the kind of laughter that arises not from amusement, but from the shock of sudden, unearned joy. The women's faces, once gaunt and drawn from months of limited nourishment, seemed to regain a faint warmth, a hint of colour returning to pale cheeks. Eyes that had long carried the weight of fear and despair now glimmered with curiosity and surprise. Fingers that had curled inward from fatigue and cold tentatively reached for another slice, another taste, savoring it as if it were a rare treasure. Even those who had hardened themselves against hope, who had believed that any act of kindness was a trap or illusion, found themselves softening in the presence of this simple, unexpected generosity. It was more than just food. It was a message, a reminder that someone, somewhere, still recognized their humanity. Each bite carried with it not only flavor, but also the faint, almost imperceptible weight of dignity restored, of a world beyond cruelty and deprivation. The environment around them seemed to respond to this transformation. The air, previously heavy with the sterile scent of the camp and the lingering anxiety of captivity, now carried the comforting warmth of baked bread and melting butter. Sunlight, filtering through narrow windows, caught the steam rising from plates, creating a golden haze that lingered in the room. The women's movements became more fluid, less rigid, as though the act of eating something nourishing for the first time in months allowed them to rediscover the simple pleasure of being alive. The room, once a stark hall filled with tension, now buzzed softly with human connection, the shared experience of tasting something that seemed impossibly good. A tiny miracle in a place defined by suffering. Even the ritual of eating became something sacred. Each woman approached her plate with reverence, mindful of each bite, aware that this moment could not be taken for granted. The crust of the bread was broken slowly, deliberately. The butter spread evenly, not wasted but cherished. Some closed their eyes, letting the flavors speak to them in silence. Others exchanged glances, sharing unspoken acknowledgement of the miracle before them. The communal experience, the understanding that they were all partaking in this small act of generosity together, added layers to the emotional impact. It was no longer merely a meal, it was an affirmation of life, a fleeting reminder that even in captivity, beauty and kindness could exist. The women's senses, dulled by months of monotony and fatigue, were awakened in a way that went beyond taste. The aroma of bread, buttery and warm, triggered memories of home, of kitchens long abandoned, of families and laughter long forgotten. For a moment, they were transported, carried away from the grey walls of the camp, and into a world where care, comfort, and human decency were not distant dreams, but tangible realities. Tears threatened in some eyes, unbidden and uncontrolled, as the realization sank in that this simple act, fresh bread, creamy butter, was a gift of dignity and humanity. No words could capture the depth of the experience. No language could fully describe the emotion of being recognized, however subtly, as a person rather than a prisoner. It was in this simple act that the paradox of war revealed itself most poignantly. These women, trained, conditioned, and hardened by the world's cruelties, were capable of surviving unimaginable deprivation. Yet it took the gentlest touch of kindness, a plate of bread and butter, to pierce the armor of disbelief and remind them of their humanity. In that hall, the boundaries of fear, resentment, and hardship blurred, replaced by the startling, almost overwhelming clarity of a basic human truth, even in captivity, even in the shadow of conflict. The smallest gestures of care have the power to transform hearts. The bread was finished too quickly, as all precious things are, yet its impact lingered far longer than the last crumb. Each woman leaned back, a quiet exhalation escaping her lips, eyes shining with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. Conversations resumed, softer now, imbued with warmth and tentative hope, and even the act of simply looking at one another carried new meaning. The taste of butter and bread had become more than a sensory pleasure. It had become a shared memory, a symbol of the possibility of goodness, even when all else seemed lost. It reminded them that the world beyond barbed wire, though distant, was still capable of care, still capable of acknowledging their humanity in ways that went far beyond mere survival. In the end, that first taste of bread and butter was a catalyst, a spark igniting emotions long dormant. The hall, the tables, the simple gestures of service all became infused with newfound significance. And as the women looked around at one another, at the soft light glinting off their plates, at the hands of the American staff delivering these simple gifts, the disbelief slowly gave way to something more profound. The scene around them was surreal, almost dreamlike, as if they had stepped into a world governed by a completely different set of rules. Rules in which patience, order, and genuine care replaced chaos, deprivation, and fear. The long wooden tables, polished to a subtle sheen, stretched across the dining hall in neat, unbroken rows, their surfaces reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights. Each place had been set with precision, plates aligned with forks, knives, and spoons, napkins folded neatly beside them. The attention to detail was meticulous, almost ritualistic, and the prisoners could not help but notice the stark contrast to the haphazard, unstructured existence they had been forced to endure for months. Every corner of the room, every chair, every simple utensil seemed to convey a silent message. That order, dignity, and respect still mattered even here. Even in a place defined by captivity, American camp staff moved through the hall with quiet grace. Their steps measured and deliberate, carrying trays of food with a care that bordered on reverence. There was a rhythm to their movements, a choreography born of experience and empathy, ensuring that no prisoner felt overlooked, neglected, or rushed. Their faces, calm and unhurried, bore expressions of quiet attentiveness, signaling that this was more than a mere distribution of food. It was a deliberate act of humanity. One woman caught the glance of a young American nurse as she handed over a plate, and in that instant, the tension of months of fear and suspicion melted slightly. The gentle nod, the soft smile, the patience extended to each prisoner. It all conveyed the unspoken truth that they were recognized as human beings, deserving of care, and not simply as prisoners of war. The prisoners observed in disbelief. Their eyes traveled across the room, taking in the meticulousness of the tables, the soft clinking of utensils, the steam rising from bowls of soup and plates of fresh bread. They had never witnessed anything like it in their lives. Months of hardship had taught them to expect the worst, to anticipate cruelty or neglect, and yet here, every detail, every gesture seemed designed to soothe rather than to punish. The sheer ordinariness of the setting, the quiet hum of activity, the warm lighting, the orderly lines of tables felt almost magical. A stark contrast to the chaos, fear, and deprivation of life beyond these walls. It was not just food that was being offered. It was a glimpse into a world that had, until now, seemed impossible. A world where kindness was not a fleeting anomaly, but a standard, deliberate practice. Each movement of the staff carried significance. Plates were set before the prisoners with care, hands steady, gestures intentional. When a slice of bread teetered slightly on the edge of a plate, a hand reached out and adjusted it without hesitation, returning the plate to perfect balance. When a prisoner hesitated, uncertain how to take the offered food, a guiding hand gently steadied the plate, a soft, encouraging word accompanying the motion. These small acts, almost imperceptible on their own, collectively created an atmosphere of reassurance and trust. For women who had endured months of deprivation and distrust, these gestures were revolutionary. Each subtle movement communicated a radical concept, that they were valued, seen, and treated with dignity, even within the confines of captivity. The visual contrast between the prisoners and the environment heightened the surrealism. Rows of women in muted grey uniforms, hair pulled back tightly, faces pale and drawn from months of scarcity, sat before polished wooden tables, each plate a small oasis of warmth and nourishment. The uniformity of their attire, once a symbol of their shared suffering, now seemed to highlight the starkness of the kindness extended to them. It was as though the camp had become a stage upon which an unlikely drama of care and humanity was unfolding, a world apart from the battlefield, the prisons, and the chaos that had defined their existence. The calmness of the staff, the soft light illuminating the room, the rhythmic movements of service, all of it created a dissonant beauty, a scene that could have been mistaken for a memory rather than reality, leaving the prisoners in a state of quiet awe. Beyond the tables, the hall itself seemed to participate in the act of kindness. Soft daylight filtered through tall, narrow windows, creating patterns on the wooden floors that danced across the prisoners' feet as they moved. The air, warmed slightly from the ovens that had baked the bread moments before, carried the comforting scent of butter and yeast, weaving through the hall like an invisible embrace. Even the walls, stark yet clean, seemed to hum with a sense of care, reflecting the attention lavished upon every detail. The environment, previously neutral or even oppressive in its utilitarian purpose, had been transformed into a space of gentle ritual, of quiet ceremony. It was as if the hall itself had been designed to reassure, to nurture, and to remind those within it that they were, at least for a moment, outside the reach of cruelty. The women's reactions were varied, but all were profound. Some could only stare, their expressions frozen in awe, taking in the rhythm and order of the scene, as if trying to comprehend how such simple acts could feel so extraordinary. Others tentatively reached for their plates, hands trembling slightly, feeling the weight not just of the food, but of the gesture itself. The act of eating became intertwined with emotion, each bite carrying the realization that someone had taken the time, made the effort, and acted with intention to ensure their comfort. There was no hurry, no command, no obligation, only a deliberate attention to the prisoner's experience. And that alone made the moment transformative. As the meal continued, the prisoners began to notice details that previously would have gone unseen. The way a napkin was carefully folded beside a plate, the gentle clatter of cutlery as it was placed neatly in alignment, the small kindnesses extended to those who moved more slowly or needed assistance, all contributed to a growing sense of wonder. Conversations began tentatively, murmurs at first, sharing observations and acknowledging the care extended to them. The initial disbelief gave way to quiet gratitude, and then, as the realization fully sank in, to awe. Here, in the midst of captivity, the familiar rules of their harsh existence had been replaced by a gentleness so unexpected, so deliberate, that it challenged their very understanding of the world around them. Even the youngest, or most hardened among them, could not escape the impact. For some, the gestures of care evoked memories of home, tables set with care, hands extended in kindness, meals prepared with love. For others, the contrast between past suffering and present nurture was almost overwhelming. A jolt to the senses that reminded them of the fragility of life and the extraordinary potential for goodness, even in the darkest of times. Slowly, laughter began to bubble up, soft and tentative, the sound of human connection re-emerging in a place where fear had once dominated every interaction. Eyes met across tables, glances shared in silent recognition of the unspoken miracle occurring before them. It was a transformation not just of circumstance, but of perception. The dining hall, the American staff, the perfectly set tables, the warm bread and butter, all of it reshaped their understanding of captivity. In that moment, imprisonment was no longer solely defined by deprivation. It could also be a space where care, dignity, and humanity could flourish, even if only fleetingly. And the most remarkable aspect of all was how the prisoners themselves responded. They did not rush, did not hoard, did not treat the moment as merely functional. They engaged with it, savored it, and allowed themselves to feel fully, in a way that defied the conditioning of months of hardship and the constant vigilance required for survival. By the end of the meal, the hall had been transformed in ways far beyond the physical. The initial disbelief had shifted into awe, the awe into quiet wonder, and the wonder into a fragile but undeniable sense of hope. The women sat back in their chairs, plates empty or nearly so, faces flushed with warmth and emotion, as the rhythm of life, so carefully orchestrated by those who served them, left an indelible mark. For the first time in months, or perhaps years, they had been part of an environment where order, patience, and genuine care were the constants, not fear, neglect, or suspicion. Every detail of the hall, every gesture of the staff, every glimmer of sunlight and rising steam from freshly baked bread had contributed to a singular, transformative experience. A glimpse of humanity at its most deliberate and profound. As the meal continued, a profound silence settled over the hall, a silence unlike any they had known before, and yet it was not a silence born of oppression, fear, or exhaustion. It was a silence of awe, a quiet reverence that swept across the room as the prisoners slowly absorbed the reality of what was happening. The clatter of dishes and soft murmur of conversation were not absent, but instead harmonized into a gentle, almost sacred rhythm, a backdrop to the transformative power of the simple act before them. For the first time in months, perhaps even years, the women felt the weight of captivity lift, if only slightly, and recognized the extraordinary within the ordinary, a meal served with patience, care, and respect, transforming not only their bellies, but their very perception of the world around them. The women, once hardened by months of war, deprivation, and the harsh discipline of life behind barbed wire, found themselves allowing vulnerability to surface. Some stared at their plates, wide-eyed and almost mesmerized, as though the fresh bread and melting butter had unlocked something buried deep within, a sense of trust, of wonder, of the fragile yet undeniable possibility of human goodness. Others exchanged quiet glances with their companions, recognizing the shared astonishment etched across each face. There was no need for words. The expression of awe, the softened eyes, the slight tilt of the head communicated volumes. Each prisoner became acutely aware that she was not alone in experiencing this miracle, that the sense of disbelief and emotional awakening was a shared one, binding them together in a way that transcended language and circumstance. The air in the hall seemed charged with subtle, invisible energy. Light streamed through tall, narrow windows, cutting across the polished wooden tables and highlighting the rising steam of bread still warm from the oven. The scent of butter, rich and sweet, mingled with the yeasty aroma of freshly baked loaves, creating an invisible embrace that filled the senses and touched the heart. Even the room itself, plain and functional in its construction, seemed to participate in the quiet reverence. Walls and floors, chairs and tables, each element harmonized to enhance the sensory and emotional experience, as if the very space had been imbued with the intention of fostering comfort, dignity, and subtle joy. For women whose previous days had been measured in the scarcity of rations and the cold calculation of survival, this environment felt almost otherworldly, a fragile oasis of humanity in a landscape otherwise defined by hardship. Every gesture of the American staff carried weight far beyond its physical action. A hand gently placing a plate in front of a hesitant prisoner, a reassuring nod, a soft word of guidance, all became magnified in importance, not because of their necessity, but because of their intentionality. Each movement was a declaration that the prisoners were seen and respected, not merely tolerated or contained. For women who had been conditioned to expect indifference or hostility, these acts were revolutionary. They challenged deeply ingrained beliefs about who they were in the world, their value, and their place within it. The power of deliberate kindness became tangible, and with it came a profound emotional shift. The understanding that even in captivity, dignity could be extended and preserved. The reactions were subtle but deeply human. Some women allowed themselves to smile, tentative at first, testing the reality of what they were experiencing. Others reached for a second slice of bread, with a sense of hesitant pleasure, savoring the warmth, the flavor, the comfort of being nourished in a way that transcended mere sustenance. There were those whose hands lingered over the plates, reluctant to end the experience, as if holding on to the bread and butter could somehow prolong the feeling of safety and acknowledgement that it embodied. Whispers spread across the room. soft observations, tentative questions, and shared marvels at the unexpected generosity surrounding them. Laughter, cautious and delicate, began to ripple quietly through the hall. A sound that had been foreign in the camp for too long. The women were not only nourished physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. Each bite became a symbol of possibility, of a world that could be gentle even amidst conflict. They had been conditioned to survive, to distrust, to measure kindness against suspicion. But now, faced with acts of intentional care, their understanding of human nature began to shift. Hope, long dormant and fragile, emerged from its hiding place in cautious glimmers. They began to imagine life beyond the constraints of the camp, to consider the reality that the world might not be as harsh and unyielding as they had been forced to believe. Even the smallest gestures, the careful placement of a plate, the warm smile of a staff member, the attentive observation of a need met, became amplified in meaning. And with it came the rekindling of emotions long suppressed, trust, gratitude, and a delicate, radiant sense of relief. There was a communal awakening in the room. The women, once isolated in their despair and individual coping mechanisms, now experienced a shared transformation. The act of receiving care together, witnessing the same gestures of human kindness, created a bond that transcended language and prior suspicion. Eyes met across tables, acknowledging mutual understanding and the shared wonder of what was happening. Even those who had struggled to believe in the possibility of good were moved by the consistency and sincerity of the experience. The meal had become a catalyst, not just for individual emotional restoration, but for a collective sense of humanity, a reminder that even in captivity, the world could offer moments of grace. As the minutes passed, the hall became a sanctuary, a space in which ordinary rules of survival and fear no longer governed behavior. The women moved with a subtle fluidity, gestures softened by trust, their attention drawn not only to the nourishment before them, but to the subtle signals of care around them. Conversations, when they emerged, were infused with warmth and curiosity, reflecting the tentative exploration of a world where they were no longer merely objects of control or surveillance, but active participants in an environment designed to honor their dignity. The very act of eating became intertwined with emotion, each bite a meditation on care, each glance a reflection on connection, each gesture a quiet acknowledgement of the possibility of goodness. The sensory experience intensified the emotional one. The bread, warm and golden, held an almost hypnotic allure. The butter, soft and creamy, melted in their mouths, a literal and figurative softening of hardened hearts. The hall resonated with the quiet cadence of appreciation, each soft exhalation, each gentle motion amplifying the sense that they were in a rare and precious moment of life, fully observed and fully respected. Time seemed to stretch, allowing the prisoners to absorb every nuance of the scene, the gleaming wooden tables, the gentle care of the staff, the soft interplay of light and steam, the warm smells that filled the room. All these elements combined to create an emotional tapestry in which the extraordinary beauty of simple kindness became undeniably real. By the end of the meal, something profound had shifted in the hearts of the prisoners. The initial awe had given way to a deep, reflective gratitude. The disbelief had transformed into acceptance and understanding. The quiet whispers had evolved into a shared, silent recognition of the moment's significance. This was not simply a meal. It was a manifestation of dignity, patience, and empathy. The women, who had been stripped of so much, had received a gift that extended beyond nourishment. It was an affirmation that they were seen, that their humanity had not been forgotten, and that even in a place defined by confinement, small miracles could occur. As the prisoners slowly rose from their seats, carrying plates now empty, there was a lingering sense of connection that refused to dissipate. They glanced at one another, exchanging soft smiles, tentative but genuine, and in those brief, wordless moments, the walls between individuals softened. The dining hall, once a functional space defined by routine and control, had become a stage upon which the transformative power of human kindness had played out. For every woman present, the memory of that meal, the taste, the care, the quiet attentiveness, the shared awe, would remain indelible. A reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, dignity and hope could still be nurtured, one deliberate, thoughtful act at a time.